Tēnā koutou and welcome to this episode of the Manawatū People's Radio and Manawatū Standard By-Election Special Series. We have Jimmy Ellingham, senior reporter with the Manawatū Standard. He'll be fact-checking throughout the interview and we'll have questions from listeners and readers towards the end. And we will be interviewing throughout this series the candidates in the Palmerston North City Council by-election, the hopefuls vying for the seat left vacant by Tangi Utikere in 2020. And in this episode, we have Stefan Speller. Good morning to you.
Good morning, how are you?
Not too bad at all. Now, you have cited on your website, right at the top of the page, you're a truly independent candidate. Is that taking a dig at some of your running mates?
It's not taking a dig, it's actually answering a question that I get asked a lot from residents. So I've had a lot of people come to me and say, if you're independent, are you too scared to declare your party affiliation? So it's actually a clarification and saying, no, I'm truly independent in the true sense of the word. I respect the views of different parties, but I feel that in Palmerston North we don't need the politics, we need Palmy, and we need Palmy over politics. I don't want to come in and say, I support a particular party when the policy might be better over here for our particular city. So it's not a dig at all at other candidates. If they choose to use independent as well, that's up to them. But for me, it's clarifying. I respect parties. I work with anyone who has good ideas for our city.
And you feel you will be capable of keeping your own personal ideologies to yourself and parking those when you're sitting around the table?
Yeah, so this is something, as an independent, it's not clear often what you stand for. For example, if you stand for a party, there's a clear mindset or affiliation that goes with that. So what I've done on the website is that you're referring to is clarify the key issues that I want to touch on, what's important to me, what matters, and what I'll be pushing. But absolutely, I think I've always been, and always am, a proponent of I might not have the best idea, but we need to find the best idea.
You've also cited your experience both on your website and in your candidate statement, which is available on the City Council website, chairing the Queen Elizabeth College Board. You've been on the Roslin School Board. You've been appointed to the Manfield Park Trust. Also your strategic and financial planning skills. Are you of the opinion that those experiences will be useful around what is quite a bureaucratic and governance space? Yes,
so there's two parts to that. One, I have governance experience, which is an understanding of how the space works, the limitations and the abilities. I've also worked in central government for some time. I've recently come back from being a ministerial and executive services advisor, which is a mouthful. But that sort of gives me the understanding of both the public service bureaucracy and the governance that's sitting above it. So I point them out saying I have an understanding of both. The difference there, I think, is as well, the chair role is significant because that is a role of leadership and accountability that sitting on a board is simply not. So I think it's especially worth pointing out. Yeah,
because you're not the only candidate to cite experience, particularly in governance, for example, school boards.
No, what I would point out.
What I would put to you is that a school board is a very different beast from.
It's a very different beast. But if you use the example of Manfield, for instance, another one, or the work I've done in Wellington, ministerial advising is more comparative. You have to provide advice to ministers within their own parliamentary setting. So I understand that space reasonably well. Also, council is not something that's new to me. As soon as when I became really interested in council and started going along, it mirrors a lot of parliament, obviously. I'm very familiar with the parliamentary standing orders, so it was quite a quick. It's similar in key ways, yeah.
You're also not the only candidate who has cited what I'd call policy issues. And, for example, allowing small businesses to flourish by limiting regulation and supporting their independence. Yeah. You will not actually have any power to do that if you're elected. It all depends on what the discussion is around the table,
That's right.
what officers bring to you, what the CEO brings to you. Yeah. Surely the focus should be on what your values are, what your ideologies are, so that people know if you reflect them or not.
And it should say at the top of that page, and we've tried to make it very clear, and it's a very big point you touch on, the limitations of council is something that I don't think the candidates are well aware of, and that's due to comments coming out like, we'll make housing affordable. Council has restrictions on what they can get coverage over. And any one councillor, as you said, in a bureaucracy, has only so much vote power anyway. So that's limited again. in that example, I've been clear to say I will advocate for, and I'll be putting forward opinions and voting towards these things. I don't think you can look at any one councillor running and say they will do these things that they have put forward. They're advocating for them to be done. And if a vote comes up or the situation is put forward, that's what they'll be aiming towards.
One phrase that you've used, and I've heard in other interviews in this series and from other candidates, is making evidence-based decisions.
Yeah.
That happens already, doesn't it?
You would say so. A good example is the CEDA discussion that came up within the last month or so at Council. It's 2021 now, isn't it? Last December. A lot of that discussion around, this is just the top example off the top of my mind, was we have 2 reports which show that CEDA has a good track record over time, and if we leave it in its current state it will do well. But the Council then had a long debate about whether or not they should be abiding by those evidence decisions and whether they should be restructuring the funding of CEDA to essentially remove
there's also evidence that there is a lot of ratepayer money going into CEDA that may be better used elsewhere. So you've got to compromise. You've got to take all of the evidence.
Yep, you do, absolutely.
So the CEDA example is, you may strongly disagree with it, and many people do. It is evidence-based as a decision. You don't agree with it.
Yeah, no, that's part of it, I'm saying. The other part there is, and it comes back to that advocating. That statement that I wrote in the profile candidate statement is the values that I bring, not necessarily what I'll be able to accomplish. By electing me into council, it won't mean that every decision is held to an evidence-based by the entire council. What it means is, for myself, I will be looking at it based on the evidence and weighing things that way.
Right.
That's the way I approach decision making.
But that's how everyone approaches decision making.
Well, assumably.
Yeah.
It's not a guarantee.
So it is happening at the moment, though, that's my point.
Yes, but it's also what I bring to the table.
Okay.
I think it's important when we're dealing with huge amounts of taxpayers' money.
Indeed. You are wanting to work towards a city that meets the needs of seniors and those with disabilities. What are the main priorities there?
So this is something I've become, I have personal experience with relatives quite close to me that have disabilities, so I've grown up in Palmerston North, experiencing some of that. Our city has some wonderful attributes, but its footpaths are not often one of them. And let's be honest, the footpaths aren't something that just affects seniors with walking frames, for example, or typically people with disabilities with wheelchairs. There are also people walking on them with prams, young parents, and lots of scooters, and now we've got the electric scooters as well. The amount of people I talk to that are reasonably able-bodied and getting into that senior sort of space and disabilities that quite regularly take tumbles around town on lips and pavement, on lovely sections of pavements that aren't joined well with the next one, it is quite ridiculous.
So, I mean, what's the solution for that? Because one assumes there are policies and procedures in place in City Council already for the maintenance of such assets. What can we do, and what can you do as one voice around a table of 16 to push for that? Yeah.
One is, there seems to be quite often a trade-off between footpathing funding and obviously, there's only a certain limited kitty you have to put, so you've got to have a trade-off. One that is put forward often is cycleways, and I think we can, if we're honest, we need to have footpaths in more of a state that's suitable before we invest in other things that are nice to haves, essentially. And I use the phrase, you need to pay your rent before you buy chocolate. Okay, you need to have your stable expected minimums done before you start buying lavish things, if you will. I think the footpaths are something that are non-negotiables. We have a city with significant amount of people that need to use these facilities. Essentially what you need to do is bring some of the funding back from some of those other camps and push it into rejuvenation and maintenance of footpaths.
But given that this is a perennial issue and people and Great Power have been advocating for precisely this issue for decades, will your presence around the council table actually facilitate any meaningful change in that space?
That's a really good question, because you're right, it comes up. You'll probably see it in lots of your candidates' statements. The point that Grey Power has been pushing for it, and Lou Finlay most, obviously as the councillor in both of those spaces, has been pushing for it, is actually an asset. And I think we need someone else on council with a severe, strong push for that, because as we said, council is a democracy. It's a voting base, and we need more people to vote for that over certain other projects. If that comes up to the table, I'll be voting for footpath maintenance. As opposed to some other projects which might be there.
Yes, because Lou Finlay is not an ignorable person.
No.
And he hasn't been able to facilitate the change that's required.
No, but put it this way, regardless of the ignorable status of the person, they're only one vote, and you need further votes in that camp.
Fair enough. Something that has not cropped up in any of the other candidate statements that I'm aware of is that you want to provide family and pet-friendly spaces. I'm guessing you're an animal man.
I'm a cat man. I tolerate dogs on occasion. No, I think we have an opportunity to be more pet-friendly. What I've been really surprised by is we are reasonably pet-friendly, but that doesn't mean we can't be better. What I talked about in the family space is I talked to a ton of parents that said, we have amazing parks, and we do, there's no denying that, we have really good parks in Palmy. What we don't have is fenced playgrounds for very young children, and we actually need a couple more of them, or essentially some that are decent. For your very young toddlers, they can't play safely on a lot of our playgrounds without having some boundaries around, or parents having to be hyper aware of that situation. And when you get with a lot of children on a playground, that can be very difficult, especially because they're near roads quite often. In terms of the pets, a lot of the spaces we have, we just need more simple things like bins and bags being provided. I've had a lot of people as well asking me for more off-leash areas, whether your dog is well trained and can be commanded well.
Because Linklater is a good example.
It is a good example. It is one example, and it is on one side of town.
And we've been trialling. Is the trial finished, Jimmy? I'm not sure. The dogs in the square are allowed on.
No, that's still going.
That's still going.
But that appears to be working well.
That's right.
We're not seeing any dramatic.
Exactly.
Issues
and the
there.
key needs to be. Linklater is a perfect example. I take my kids there reasonably often. We live around that area. You can be there and have a picnic and have well-trained dogs. It really is reliant on the dog owner themselves to have that dog well-trained. But where we have a well-trained animal, there should be space for them to use that.
Turning to the issue of council engagement, I note that you've committed to holding meetings. Andy Asquith, who we interviewed this morning, also said a similar thing. He wants to see not necessarily the ward system, but councillors actively going and holding meetings. Is that the answer to engagement, or are you just going to get the already engaged at those things?
I think there's two parts. The engagement falls in two fronts. It falls with particular issues, for example, council consulting over any topic, the dogs in the square, for example. Consulting, going out efficiently to people, that's one part. The engagement that I was talking about in the part two, and they need to be balanced together, is engagement with councillors. I think councillors are making decisions for the community, and they can't make it without the community, and they need to be open not just to the people that they are associated with naturally, but people that also want to engage with them. I've found a huge apathy towards council, which probably wouldn't surprise most people here in this process. But what I have found is that when you educate people on what council does and what it could do, they are really excited. And I think there's room for that. What I do see though in that space is I've been talking about coffee and korero, we've been calling them, sessions which is similar to what Andy was proposing, essentially moving around the city and having regular spaces. And there's no boundaries to what that could be. It could be a coffee shop, it could be a town hall style meeting, who knows. But my part of that would be getting councillors there to be engaged in the community, but also telling community what they're doing. Because a lot of that stuff that's in council is really interesting, that's talked about in council meetings, but isn't in the paper because it's one thing amongst 10, or it's just not advertised by the council well.
Just before we hand over to Jimmy, and I'm conscious of time, but very quickly, just on that notion of engagement and consultation, what's your preferred option as a result of the Nature Calls consultation and the wastewater reform? Because there were a number of options there, and some of them were really pricey.
They were. From 300 to 905 or 950 almost, isn't it, per year in rates. Possible increases. I'm waiting. I have a preferred option, but I'm waiting to see what the final costings are, because as you say, some of them are very pricey, and the costings that we've got are still preliminary. So I'm waiting to see more on the final end. But I think the three important things we need to be very aware of are the environmental impact, because we have the Manawatū River and we can't take that for granted at all, but it's a player in this discussion. The financial impacts to our residents. The third part I think is equally as important, is knowing that the three water reforms are coming up and have looming implications for us. We need to be very able to adjust whatever we do. We can't lock ourselves into a 25-year system of water care that we may actually choose to move to another better model in 3 years when it becomes available, because we've locked ourselves in here.
Thank you, Stefan. Let's turn to Jimmy from the Manawatū Standard for questions from readers and listeners.
Right. Yes, thank you, Fraser, and thanks, Stefan, for being here. Before we just turn to readers and listeners, just looking at your website again, we talk about how you support and progress social programs, including public housing, community and support for cultural groups. The public housing, can I just ask you a bit about your position there?
Yeah.
Is your position there more social housing from the City Council?
So it's sort of threefold, and the word public and social get thrown about together, but they're not the same thing. So I would be advocating for continued building of council flats, is kind of what they're tokenly known as, in Palmy. I would also be advocating for a better, closer relationship with central government, with Kainga Order, which is our Housing New Zealand, previously.
Do you think there is a good relationship at the moment between the council and Kainga Order, and if so, has it achieved anything? Because those waiting lists for public housing are growing, yet and we do have more state houses being built, but the number is not actually increasing.
You're right, and partly because the number of housing isn't increasing at the same rate that we need it to be. But I think currently we can certainly do better with Kainga Order, and that isn't on their end as much as us having a discussion around what do you need in terms of development. And if we're saying, hey, look, we're putting our whakarongo, for example, new settlement out, a new area, how can you use this space well? What do you need in terms of infrastructure particularly? Because what I wouldn't want to see is public housing being built on housing that's already existing, because that's really not resolving our situation at all. I'd want to see it developing in new areas.
This relates in a way to our most popular question from readers and listeners, which is how do you keep our rates down? But perhaps we've been asking it as a way of how do you balance not making rates increases so they're unaffordable with the spending areas, the things you've identified, such as social housing, even footpath maintenance, that sort of thing. That costs money. So how do we balance that?
Yeah, it's a very good question.
Keeping rates affordable.
And you're right. I don't think I'm certainly not campaigning for bringing rates down. I don't think it's reasonable. We need to be very realistic about the world we live in. If we lower the rates, for example, we lower the services that the council provides, and I don't think people want that. In fact, they want further services. What I will say is that where rates increases need to happen, they need to be very well clarified, they need to be very well justified, and they need to be obvious why it's being increased. For example, we're adding further services, we're upgrading our water maintenance trials. You can join those dots, if you will.
Just to interrupt, sorry, Stefan, that's a way of saying if rates were to increase 2 to 3%, you want to say that's being spent on. So, for example, social housing, roading, A, B, and C.
I would want it to be clear where it's being spent in exactly.
Because people might say it is now because it isn't that long-term or annual plans, but there's no... Are you actually saying you want some fact sheet, if you like, for a lack of a better word, which clearly tells residents something that's accessible to them rather than buried in a...
Oh, absolutely. Document. So I've been reading through the annual budget 2021. This is the relevance of the boards previously you asked about. I understand financials quite well, right? This is my bread and butter, or one of the parts. That's a very messy, ugly document, let's be honest, and not many people are reading that, and the very few that are, there's still information I have asked for from council about that. This is your complete documents, but there's still stuff that I would like to know in there. That absolutely needs to be more accessible, and council in general needs to make themselves more accessible, not just online. That's not good enough. It needs to be also provided to people in a way they can actually deal with it.
Thanks, Stefan. I think we have probably time for 2 more questions before we have to wrap up. But you've touched on this one as well in a way by saying footpaths is perhaps your priority. But one of the questions was, how do you fix our roads? But also alongside that, cycleways. Can you actually state your position on that? Exactly. For example, the ones proposed for around the city at the moment, the likes of Albert Street, Featherston Street. Do you support more cycleways?
I do support cycleways. And let me be clear, I support cycleways because I think they're an important part of our city. They're important to our sort of the culture we have in our city of open, quite an energetic young city. What I will say is it needs to be balanced. For example, if we're outspending our footpaths or our roading, which we won't be outspending the roading, but if we're outspending other parts, that's not responsible. And again, it comes back to that we need to pay our rent before we buy chocolates. It's that key issue again. We need to have our key issues stable and our footpaths managed before we start essentially splashing out into the area of extra cycleways at this point. But I 110% support cycleways in general. And if we could manage both our footpaths and that would be ideal. I think it's just about how we go about doing that, at which rate.
And a final question we've been asked to ask every candidate is, who nominated you and who seconded you?
It's a very, very good question. So You want a quick answer, don't you?
Yeah,
essentially,
possible.
Vaughan Dennison as the national affiliated or related sort of councillor. I also had a very, very good friend of mine who was my deputy chair on the board who was a big Labour supporter. So I wanted to prove a bit of independence and say, look, I have actually weight and respect from both of these audiences. What happened though is my good friend Manawatū Plumridge, who was passed away in a house fire 2 days before the nomination period sort of ended. So my father ended up signing for me, who was a bit of a fiasco in itself because he has limited motor control. So we had to have a bit of a discussion with council around this fact that his signature was valid. So I was really, really honoured to be essentially signed for by 3 people. But just 2, of course, on paper. Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
Here we go, and from me, thank you as well. That's all we have time for in this episode of the NPR and Manawatū Standard by-election special. Other episodes are available at npr.nz/show/by-election21, with the series also running throughout the first week of February, Monday to Friday at 9 a.m. on NPR, which is 999 AM across Manawatū, or via our live stream at npr.nz. Of course, keep an eye on the Manawatū Standard for further coverage of the candidates and their campaigns, and of course the results, which will be announced on the 22nd of February. Remember, your vote must be posted by 12 p.m. on Wednesday the 17th of February in a DX mailbox or directly to the City Council for your vote to count in this election. Thank you for joining us. Tēnā koutou.